Good. All right, welcome everybody. Good morning to all of you who are just joining us. This is a webinar on the Earth Science Remote Learning resource that's driven by the phenomenon of the Pacific Ring of Fire. So getting into the concepts around Earth's interior and plate tectonics. And we're going to have our implementation focus for today is peer-to-peer discussion. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I know many of you, and it's really nice to see some familiar faces, some of those people that would regularly attend our in-person PDs or that I have connections with online, people from upstate. But my name is, if we haven't met before, my name is John Salazar. I'm on the New Visions science team. And I've been with New Visions for about the last 5.5 years, a little bit more than that even, I think, and mostly focused on supporting earth science and chemistry. And I'll go ahead and allow my colleague, Kieran, who is today's co-host, and she's going to be helping out with all like the technical stuff. Actually, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself instead of doing it for you.
Hi, everyone. I'm in your chat window as NVPS, and so if you need any help with connecting or with getting anything to work, or with finding a resource, just let me know. And I'm going to be chatting links to things that John is referring to as we go through the session as well, just to make sure everybody has access.
Thanks, Karen. And so this is sort of part of a webinar series. Now, like I said, I work on both earth science and chemistry, so we're kind of like alternating between those two topics and focusing on remote learning plans. But as you could see, on April 30th, we had a session that was focused on Google Classroom, and we're using a chemistry pressure cooker learning plan. So if you want to access those videos, they should be up on the site soon. You can see the different ways that we're suggesting or that we're trying to use Google Classroom for that implementation of that remote learning resource. Today, we are focusing on peer-to-peer discussion again and using the Earth Science Ring of Fire plan. And then next week, it is a we are using that same chemistry resource, but there's an implementation focus for formative assessment and feedback. And so even if you teach earth science and you don't teach chemistry, but you're interested in thinking about formative assessment and feedback in this remote learning setting, then you should feel more than welcome to join us for that session. So I'm going to just go ahead and go over the agenda for today. So as I said, we're going to focus on peer-to-peer discussion. So we're going to have a little chat about why peer-to-peer discussion matters. And then we're going to take a look at an overview of the Pacific Ring of Fire learning plan. So I'm just going to kind of walk through the different sort of components of that learning plan and what they're all about. And then we're going to actually do a couple of peer-to-peer discussion strategies or routines, you should say, I could say. And one of them is going to be in a synchronous setting, so live as we are right now. And then the other one will be using a site called Flipgrid, where you'll be sort of pretending you're working asynchronously. We're going to put you in your own independent breakout room to do a little bit of work on Flipgrid. And I can say more about that when we get to it. And then we're going to have a little bit of a debrief and discussion about just how the supported student or peer-to-peer discussion and some ways that you might use it with your students. So let's go over the goals and agreements. So we want to introduce you, I mean, some of you might already be familiar with this instructional model. We're using the same model for all our remote learning plans in science, but we want to make sure that everybody's familiar with that instructional model. And then we're going to demonstrate or model some remote learning best practices around peer-to-peer discussion. And again, one is embedded in a synchronous launch of this learning module. So we'll do the launch together. And then the second one is asynchronous work time. That's a little bit further along in the learning plan. And then I'll just share again and remind people the different ways that New Vision Science is here to support you. Oops, I had a double slide. That's not necessary. And then some norms and agreements. First, we have some technical norms that we just want to make sure everybody's aware of. Please be sure that your mic is set to mute when you're not speaking. And Kieran, as the host, will have you on automatically muted. She'll have control over that. But there will be points where I'll just ask you to simply unmute yourself and share, or you could raise your hand to just indicate you want to share and then unmute yourself at the appropriate time. And that's just in case you have some background noise that might just be distracting to others in the session. All the resources, slides, instructional materials, the recordings will be made available after the session, so don't worry about access to those. And I'll actually be taking you to the site and showing you how to navigate that. And again, the presentation of this portions of this webinar is being recorded. And if you missed what I was saying about that earlier, don't worry, nobody's image is going to be on screen. I'm the only person that will show up in the recording. And norms and agreements around social and emotional learning. I think that it's important that right now we recognize that the complexity and in the different challenges that people might be experiencing. We all have different situations. I know I'm by myself at home, and that's sometimes a little bit challenging. I know some people are with their entire family, and that has its own challenges. But just recognize that people are sort of having different experiences during this time, and we're going to be just patient, as the next bullet says. This is also, just due to the fact that people have given different levels of comfort with Zoom. So let's just be all understanding of each other and patient with each other as we work through this webinar. So why does peer-to-peer discussion matter? So we're going to go ahead and enter this conversation through a microroutine called Relate. And this is something these are some routines that some of the New Vision's curriculum and professional development managers that specialize in supporting literacy and math at the middle school level, but a lot of these routines also are definitely applicable at the high school level. So this is how the routine is going to flow. I'm going to show you an image in a moment, which is actually going to be a graph from some survey data of students, and just basically how they're dealing with this transition to remote learning environment. And we'll look at that for about 30 seconds. And I want you to just think of this prompt. This reminds me of, and just make some connections to that. And then you're going to have 45 seconds to think about the fact, sorry, I'm trying to move my window here. To think about this graph in this case, and how it connects to something we've already learned in class, or in this case, you're going to think about how it connects to teaching high school science. And then lastly, I'm going to just ask you to share one of those connections in the chat window. And you could just go ahead and do this by using this prompt here. This is similar to when we blank, or just make you don't have to use the sentence starter if it's not helpful, but just make, again, a connection to high school science. And those details will be in the slides that follow. Just want to give you an overview of the routine. So this is a question from the survey that I referred to. And this particular question asked students, how would you describe the adjustment of the majority, or I'm sorry, this is for teachers. How would you describe the adjustment of the majority of your students? And you could see the data there. So I want you to, again, take 30 seconds. I think that's visible for everybody now. I'll try to make it big on this slide too. So make a personal connection to the facts, quotes, ideas. This reminds me of, and you can think about your own students in your classes at school. So about 30 seconds. Okay, it's been 30 seconds here. Now I want you to take 45 seconds to think about this graph and what it just reminded you of, and make some connections to something you know about teaching high school science, and even particularly in this current remote learning setting. let's give you 45 seconds. I'll put this bigger version up for you. Okay, that was 45 seconds. Okay, so we're gonna give everybody about a minute to share the connection in the window. You could use the sentence starter if that's helpful, or go ahead and just put in whatever words you see appropriate. And again, share that in the chat window whenever you're ready. You have a minute to do so. Yeah, Paul is sharing about how it's connection to the new standards, which in some ways, you know, it's also it is definitely a big change, just like this has been. So you certainly see the connection there. And Nam is sharing that this seems pretty similar to the way that his students are dealing with this transition. And we've heard that from many teachers yesterday in the learning environment workshop. A lot of people expressed that as well. I'll give, there's just a few more seconds to share if you haven't already. And I'm going to ask a couple people to maybe just elaborate a little bit further. And so I'm going to ask Paula and Sabrina. Let's have Paula go first. If Paula, you want to just go ahead and unmute yourself, if you could say a little bit more about your comment about similarities to the new standards.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to apologize. I have 3 kids, a dog, and a bunch of cats, so I get interrupted all the time. So I just want to apologize, first of all.
That's totally fine.
Okay. Well, I find that people are just resistant to change in general. And this is a huge change, just learning in this way, being home all the time, being with our families. A lot of people aren't even used to that. And honestly, I find the same with the new standards, the new NGSS standards, where we're expected to put more on the kids and less on us. And the kids just don't like that. They're very resistant to having more responsibility on them. So
yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. It's a really good point. Sabrina, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and elaborate a little bit more on how your students have been doing with this?
Sure. I think it's a lot. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's very similar to what you see in class. Like the kids who usually, you know, do really well have adapted rather quickly. There's a few students that usually struggle in class but have been doing better, but that's like the anomaly. It's not really that common. And then you have another bunch of students who are struggling either because of the schedule or because of the discipline required or because of access to technology that haven't been able to catch up as quickly.
Yeah, I think we've heard that a lot about like differences in schedules for sure, which makes it challenging for some students to connect at a particular time of the day that you might be trying to deliver some content or have some instruction that's synchronous. And so I think that's really important to think about. And today, again, we're going to look at like one form of peer-to-peer discussion that can be done asynchronously. So for those students that really cannot connect at a particular time because their schedule is weird, where they have to wait for technology to be freed up in their household. So yeah, I think we could continue to talk about like how this peer-to-peer discussion could be helpful and maybe even addressing some of these struggles that students have had with the transition, keeping them connected, giving some sort of a social accountability and support through peer-to-peer discussion. And so you can see here like some of the reasons that we have been prioritizing peer-to-peer discussion in science. And like Paula mentioned about the new standards, which is very much based on making sense of phenomena. It's important for students to give feedback to one another so they can sort of bounce ideas back off of each other and maybe learn something from each other or adjust their initial thinking. You could ask questions, discuss text, and just how to figure out how to navigate investigations in general. And as we mentioned, like the social aspect of it, it's important just connecting with peers, provide a social context for science, and I'm sure we can name a bunch of other reasons. And of course, this is in a synchronous setting in a classroom. This is a lot of the reasons that we prioritize peer-to-peer discussion. But I think now it's important to think about, you know, what is that we're going to prioritize in an asynchronous classroom setting or this remote learning environment. So I want you to just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this webinar. And again, you'll have some experience with a couple of different ways to engage in peer-to-peer discussion. And we could talk about like, you know, what was useful about it? Why does it support students? And some of the ways that you might use it. Okay, so we're going to do a fly overview, sort of a 50,000-foot view of this particular remote learning resource that's driven by the Ring of Fire phenomenon. And first, I'll go ahead and actually show you how to navigate to that site. And Kieran actually just chatted the remote learning plan in the chat window. You're going to have to exit out of here real quick. So there is the URL for it, remote.newvisions.org. Okay, so it's going to take us to this site here. This is the remote teaching and learning site for New Visions, or the homepage for it. And you can see you could go to this link here for curricular resources, and you could also access that from the top bar here. And we are looking at science today. And so you'll see that we've developed a number of different plans. We have one for chemistry, we have two for earth science so far, a few for living environment, and we've also have developed some focus on COVID-19, and those are interesting. Some sort of like one of them addresses the living environment standards as well through this COVID-19 lens. And then the other one I think is both, Kieran, maybe you could say a little bit more about it, but it's living environment and I believe algebra standards that are being covered. So it's like a multidisciplinary look at the COVID-19 or investigation around COVID-19. And I'll just quickly mention too, I'm not going to get into detail on this, but I would invite you to explore some of these other different tabs here, like educational technology. In this one that says teaching with text, so they have all kinds of different videos and just guidance around using technology in this remote setting. We have some really great people at New Visions that are very savvy with that sort of thing, so I highly recommend it. Okay, let me go back to the presentation here. And, you know, as we talk about the support that New Visions is offering for science and for all educators in general, I think there's some important things, changes that have taken place around Regents, credits, et cetera. As we all know that the Regents exam has been canceled. So this is a chance for schools, this means that schools will be in remote learning through June. And so as we think about support and we all work together, you know, we're really trying to prioritize, as we said, this is a challenging and complex time. So we're trying to prioritize like supporting students and making sense of things that matter. So whether it's about this experience, being at home for all this time, or it's just like more than ever, really trying to make things like more engaging and relevant to them, because we know that it's been challenging to get them to engage and participate. And so I think this is, with the Regents exam being canceled, there's an opportunity to really focus more on that. And along with that, since the Regents exam is canceled, I'm sure all of you know, like that students are going to have to show some sort of form of evidence of mastery in order to get the credit for the course. And so that's something that we're going to be working on, or that we've been thinking about as we've been designing these learning plans in these webinars. And next week is formative assessment and feedback, but I'll just mention that because that's, I think, related to this idea of demonstrating evidence of mastery. And we want to provide resources that are both good for asynchronous and synchronous environments, because again, there's such a range of situations for both teachers and students. So we're trying to be mindful of that as we design things and provide support. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, if you've joined us before for one of these webinars, and maybe, and if you haven't, you might be familiar with these terms, but synchronous is online in real time. Asynchronous is people working on their own time in their own place, and then blended instruction is, of course, a combination of the two. All right, so let's get into the actual learning plan itself. So again, this is a 50,000-foot view. And this is so you can better understand the flow of this instructional model. But it starts with the launch, which is always focused on a particular phenomenon. Again, in this case, the Pacific Ring of Fire. And students, often we've been having watch a video or look at data and just note observations, for example, and connect to prior learning. I mean, as you've probably noticed, the learning plans that we've been putting together or sort of re-engagement with content that they've probably already seen earlier, but through a different lens. And so this is an opportunity to tap into that prior learning. And you'll see one way to do that a little bit later. The work time in this particular case, students are always going to be provided with some sort of handout to scaffold the investigation process. But that'll also consist of like some videos, maybe looking at data. In this particular case, they're going to look at a density column. Actually, I'll get into those details a little bit later, but essentially, this is a work time that could be done in an asynchronous setting. So again, students can work at their own pace. We've recommended that this is about 1 to 2 weeks of instruction in this context. But of course, you want to rely on your school expectations to think about how much time you give students to work on this. And concurrently with that work time, or towards the end, you could have some sort of point set up for check-ins, which could be yourself, of course, giving feedback to students on a particular part of the assignment. We've made some suggestions about sort of like the different points of formative assessment that we suggest to focus on for feedback. And you could also create some opportunities for students to give each other feedback. And again, we're going to do one example of asynchronous peer-to-peer discussion where there could be an opportunity for them to respond to each other. And then finally is the wrap-up. So students have now gotten feedback, perhaps refined responses if appropriate. And in this case, they're going to now watch a video that's about the Pacific Ring of Fire and gets more into the actual science, like behind it, like why is it that it's there, why does it exist? And students can use that to, they respond to a couple questions, kind of just like wrap it up and like finalize their responses about why it's formed and why it's important to think about preparedness, since you know that there's a bit of a risk in that area. All right, so that's the 50,000-foot view. And now we're going to actually go into sort of an immersive experience with the ring of, oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm still getting into the details of this. Not quite yet, I'm getting ahead of myself. So these are just some details for each one of the sections. So this is the launch, and we'll experience this. And then this is what I was mentioning about the work time. The first part is just really trying to think about what's inside the Earth. And so they look at this density column video, they make sense of like why it layers the way it does, and then they apply that learning to Earth's interior. So you can see this is similar to the resources that are in Unit 2 from the New Visions curriculum. So it's just been sort of repurposed with this different lens. And then how does the heat from, this is the second part of the work time, is how does heat from Earth's core lead to formation of volcanoes and eruptions? And so again, this is a combination of a video, there's a text about like how temperature and density affects sinking and rising, and then they complete this annotated diagram, which you're gonna have an opportunity to do a little later in the session, but they're gonna go ahead and complete and explain their diagram, focusing on like the role of temperature and density differences. And there's some time for student check-in, as we mentioned earlier. And you could maybe comment on student work if it's on Google Doc. You can, if you're using Google Classroom, that's another way. And then you could have peers share with one another. And so I totally got ahead of myself on that previous slide. So I feel like we're being a little redundant at this point. But again, there's the wrap up here where students are able to bring some closure to this, their understanding around the Pacific Ring of Fire. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this learning plan so far? If you do, go ahead and please just post that in the chat window. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this point. And that again was just an overview. We'll just be going into small pieces as learners today. But I certainly encourage you to take a much closer look and follow up if you do have questions. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the launch activity. So we are going to use another micro routine called recall for this launch activity. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that you might want to think about in the launch activity is tapping into students' prior knowledge. Since this might be content that they've already engaged with, if not in your class, certainly even in middle school. And so that's what we're going to go ahead and do with this recall routine. Okay, so we're going to have, it's actually going to be like a 2-minute video to look at a text. This is a visual text in the form of a video. And then after that, I'm going to give you 45 seconds to just list everything that you remember from the video on paper. So you might want to make sure you have something to write with. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to share a connection. And this is in the live chat. We're actually going to go ahead and do this in 3 to 4 person breakout rooms. And so if you don't know what that is, essentially Karen's going to randomly put you into groups of 3 to 4 where you have your own little Zoom breakout. And you're going to just take turns sharing those connections for a couple of minutes you'll have. And you can use that sentence starter. This is similar to when we learn. This is like that time, so on and so forth. So I just want to give you an overview of the routine before we get started. Okay, so get ready. All you have to do is really watch for now. And I'm going to actually, Karen's going to share the video for us. So I'll stop sharing for just a moment.
There's another world beneath the ocean's surface. Come join us as we explore the depths below. Orange and red flashes in the pitch black. Lava oozes from the cracks and rolls across the ocean floor. Earthquakes rumble and roar as tectonic plates grate against each other. We're at the rim of the Pacific Basin. Because it is one of the most geologically active places on Earth, scientists have nicknamed the area The Ring of Fire. The movement of tectonic plates has created a nearly continuous series of oceanic trenches and chains of volcanoes stretching for 25,000 miles. The Ring of Fire is home to hundreds of volcanoes, but most remain hidden far below the water's surface. In fact, 75% of all volcanic activity on the Earth happens in the ocean. But the effects of all this activity aren't felt only in the Pacific Basin. Earth's ocean and geology are global interconnected systems that can affect us all. Tsunamis can be generated by underwater earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or landslides. And as we have seen, their impacts can be devastating. Undersea volcanoes produce chemicals and heat that affect the ocean environment. We need to better understand these natural inputs as we increasingly introduce our own with man-made pollutants. We've only recently begun to explore the hundreds of volcanoes rising from the ocean floor that make up the Ring of Fire. Over the last few decades, several expeditions to the Western Pacific Basin have been conducted. Using the latest mapping and robotic instruments, researchers have learned more about the geologic activity of these sites and the marine life that thrives on hydrothermal vent systems.
All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen again, and so you could have the prompt for what you're doing now. And so I want you to take 45 seconds, list everything that you remember from the video that stood out to you. And then I want you to, if you have the paper in front of you, you could show it to the camera, and I'll let you know when to stop. So take 45 seconds to write, and as soon as you're ready, show it up to the camera. All right. So it's okay if nobody want to show it to the camera, it's fine. I'm sure that I trust that you all wrote down all the things that you remembered. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go to, as I mentioned earlier, into breakout rooms of 3 to 4. And as Kieran goes ahead and sets up those breakout rooms, I want you to think about how some of these things that you remember from the video connect to prior learning in this unit. So you could think about, again, all the concepts that your students covered when you have worked on this topic previously in the year. And then just, you can use one of these sentence starters and just take turns sharing when you get to the breakout room. You could chat Kieran if you have any issues for whatever reason in the breakout room, but it's gonna automatically send you back after 2 minutes. We'll give you a little warning as well. All right, so let's do a little debrief around this recall micro routine. So just the question is, how did the recall micro routine support peer-to-peer discussion? And so if you look at that little image right there, it's showing you how you could do reactions. And so if you want to just go ahead and raise your hand or give a thumbs up or something to let us know you want to share out, and then just unmute yourself. And if you're having a hard time finding the reaction button, I think you could also access it through participants. But you could also just unmute yourself at this point if you want to share. Go ahead.
Okay, it's just it's a relief to be in a breakout room with a couple other people initially. There's a sense of relief. Okay, here we can talk about our experiences. As an adult learner, I like that. I assume that students would like that too, but we didn't. I think ideally you would want more time in a breakout room to get it going, because just little connections that you want to make with people, so you need more time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I felt like when we did this earlier this week, it seemed like too much time, so I cut it, but you're right, it does. Sometimes you want to just say hello and then also have time to discuss what you're supposed to discuss. It's a good point, but you could adjust that as appropriate.
Right.
Anybody else want to share? Go ahead, Paula.
I wasn't sure what we were supposed to be doing, but I was saying that, you know, I would hope that kids would make the connection with density, because we almost always in our science start out in with density ideas. So, you know, maybe they would make the connection that things are moving, things are coming up because they're somehow less dense. Well, why are they less dense? What's going on? And maybe they can start to break down what's happening underneath with heat, because usually we connect heat with density, and maybe that will get that whole discussion going, I would hope.
Yeah, that'd certainly be an ideal connection. And if students don't make that connection, it's formative assessment information for you, and you're now well aware of what they're thinking about as they go into this investigation, and how you might want to prompt them to think about other things.
Right.
Anybody else want to respond to this? Okay, great. Thank you for the two of you for sharing. All right, so now we're going to do a peer-to-peer discussion. We're going to pretend that this is sort of like an asynchronous setting where you're going to be put into an independent breakout room and have some independent work time. So I'd like for everybody to go ahead and Kieran is going to chat this URL and the password, which is case sensitive, so make sure that you're paying attention to the ND being capital. And so the URL will take you to a place where you could go ahead and enter a password and access the Flipgrid grid about volcano formation diagrams. So go ahead and take a moment to do that. Make sure everybody has an opportunity or is able to do that. And so looks like you've already done all this. You're going to be all alone for 5 minutes, as it says. And you're going to use the Flipgrid as if you're navigating this assignment on your own in an asynchronous setting. So these instructions will be in the grid itself. You might have already seen them, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to look at these and ask any clarifying questions before we actually move into independent work time. But basically, you're creating a diagram that explains how heat from the core leads to the formation of volcanoes and eruptions. We have already gone through the beginning of this learning plan, so you've been able to recall and refine your understanding of all these relevant concepts for this diagram. And so I know everybody's prepared to engage with this. But on a piece of paper, I want you to draw that diagram that explains, again, how the heat from the core leads to the formation of volcanoes. And I want you to pay attention to the criteria, please. So arrows to show the motion of convection in Earth's mantle, an indication of where on Earth's surface volcanoes would form in your diagram, and then annotations that indicate how differences in temperature and density play a role in driving the convection. So go ahead. Does anybody have any questions before Kieran sends us off to the Flipgrid? I'm sorry, to your own personal breakout room? And this is maybe not super apparent, but if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen when you're in the grid, there's a big green plus sign. All you have to do is click on that plus sign and it'll allow you to start filming your video. So we're going to check in about 4 or 5 minutes. You don't have to have a super sophisticated diagram, but essentially you're going to go ahead and create that diagram, and then you're going to record a video where you talk through your diagram, paying particular attention to this criteria as you talk through it. I'm going to assume that the quiet is because everybody's ready to go. Kieran, can you send us to independent breakout rooms? So now can you record your diagram through Flipgrid and just talk through it? I think, and you might want to join your breakout room. I think. Go ahead here. Nam, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so I think behind whatever window you're on, there must be a little window for you to join your own breakout room. And while you're in that, there's also an opportunity to provide feedback. So if I look at, I'm not going to show your video now, I promise. Oh, I lied. But I would have the opportunity to then respond and give feedback through this reply. I could also go ahead and give video feedback, and there are a number of ways I could respond to students, and you could also have students respond to each other, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's go back to the presentation here. So thank you to everybody for engaging with that. I know it was a little quick. I just want to give you a taste of one thing that you could do in this remote learning plan. We're not going to do this breakout here. As far as one way you can use Flipgrid in this remote learning plan, but let's go ahead and just debrief a little bit about it. So same question as before, but about Flipgrid now. How did the Flipgrid support peer-to-peer discussion, or how can you see it supporting peer-to-peer discussion? And you can maybe even give some examples of other ways that you might use it. So go ahead and just, you could just unmute yourself and share out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it encourages kids to respond to each other, to watch each other, learn from each other, or question each other. I usually tell kids that not everybody is right and not everybody's wrong, and sometimes it's a little bit of in between, and we can work together to get to even understand more. So I think it's a great way to encourage discussion.
Yeah, they can definitely learn from each other. Maybe they'll see somebody else's video. Oh, like I like the way that he or she used arrows to show the flow of matter, or that they annotated about temperature and density. Let me add that to mine. Yeah, that's a really good point. Go ahead, Lisa.
Could you use a prompt before you did this to say, okay, we're going to be watching some of these videos, and want you to be looking for things that other people did that you really thought were effective?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, maybe provide some like a lens for giving feedback, or for just elevating things that people did well.
And so I'm wondering, how does that happen after everybody watches Flipgrid or watches their explanations? How do you bring them back to do that?
Yeah, I think prior to actually launching this task, like you said up front, tell them that this is what they're gonna have to create the video themselves and then respond to a classmate. And maybe again, you could give them a couple things to think about, like did they show the role of temperature and density? Did they have arrows to show the movement of matter? So basically looking at that criteria could be one way to have them respond to each other. I think that's a really great idea. Anybody else?
Yeah,
one more. Yeah,
I think it's a good way for the students to be engaged while they're in a online classroom, instead of kind of sitting there and just watching and not being a participatory part of the class. So it engages them. But I do see, well, for me, I did go through the process, but I could see where I would lose some students navigating all of the things unless it is something that I do on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think hopefully it was a fairly smooth experience for everybody, but yeah, I think just taking the time to make sure that students are able to get on there. Okay, and maybe the first time you'll have some issues, but over time it'll get easier.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, they'll do a lot better than I do.
All right.
And students are more fascinated to do video recording. Nowadays they're good with the TikTok. Like they want to share, record instead of just speaking. They can record something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I just want to be mindful of the fact that we are getting near the end of our time. But that being said, I'll stick around. You're welcome to stick around if we want to continue to share ideas about how to use this. But before we do officially end the session, I just wanted to share about science support from New Visions. We initially had regularly scheduled office hours. We didn't have a lot of people coming to those, but if you do want to follow up and just ask questions about the learning plans or the different resources that we're sharing, or just have a thought partner around something, you could feel free to email myself or Kieran or anybody on the science team and schedule some hours to talk about whatever it is that you need support with. I showed you the remote learning site. We're going to be adding some new plans about every 3 weeks. I do have a plan to develop a couple more earth science ones before the end of the year. So stay tuned for those. And yeah, and stay tuned for the next webinar. I know the next one's using the chemistry remote learning plan, but I think it should be a really good one about formative assessment and feedback if that's something that's of interest to you. I've been asked to share this slide. Even during this time, there are some schools that are hiring. New Visions is hiring. Several of you work for New Vision schools, and I'm not encouraging anybody to leave their school, but in case you know somebody that's interested in looking for a teaching job right now. And then Kieran just chatted the feedback form. If you go ahead and please take a couple minutes to fill that out. As always, we really value your feedback for all our professional development, especially these webinars that we're all sort of navigating for the first time. We'd love to hear your thoughts.